Hi, I'm Sarah Solis, Director of SAR Press, and I want to welcome all of you to our first ever virtual book launch, a conversation between editors of our brand new Archaeologies of Empire, co-published with UNM Press, and our previously published Imperial Formations, both from our advanced seminar series. Please use the question box to ask any questions, and I will try to get to those as we go. And before we jump into the conversation, let me just introduce our panelists. First, we have Michael Brown, president of SAR. We have Anna Boozer, who's a co-editor of Archaeologies of Empire and an associate professor of Roman Mediterranean archaeology and history at Brute College and the Graduate Center, City University of New York. We have Bleda During, co-editor of Archaeologies of Empire and associate professor in Near Eastern archaeology at Leiden University. We have Peter Perdue, co-editor of Imperial Formations and professor of history at Yale University. And finally, Bradley Parker. He co-organized the seminar on which Archaeologies of Empire is based, but did not live to see the publication of the book, which is dedicated to him. I am going to just jump into the first question. The introduction to Imperial Formations frames the volume in the following way, quote, "We take up the notion of imperial formation as a critical analytic to underscore not the inevitable rise and fall of empires, but the active and contingent process of their making and unmaking. Our interest lies less in institutions and fixed ideologies than in the prevalence of blurred genres of rule and partial sovereignties. Empires may be things, but imperial formations are not. Imperial formations are polities of dislocation, processes of dispersion, appropriation, and displacement. They are dependent on both moving categories and populations. Not least, they are dependent on material and discursive postponements and deferrals. Imperial formations are not steady states, but states of becoming." So I wonder if all three of you could briefly describe how your work speaks to this perspective on empires as processes and states of becoming. And Anna and Bleda, why is it important to bring archaeology into this conversation?
Do I go first, or?
Yeah, you go first.
All right, I'll just first give a quick 5-minute overview of my own experience or involvement in the archaeology and history of empires. I myself is a historian of China, the Qing Dynasty. But I was part of, first I'd say it's very, very sad that Brad Parker died 2 years ago when he was only in his 50s. It's a terrible shock and a loss to me and to all of us. And I'm very glad that this is at least in part being given in his memory. He was a great pioneer for the study of frontiers. He organized a conference at the University of Utah in 2001 that I attended. The papers there were published in 2005, co-edited by him and Lars Rodseth under the title Untaming the Frontier. It covered archaeology, the Roman Empire, Chinese history, and many other topics. It was very refreshing for me as a historian of China, of early modern China, to find that archaeologists were exploring many of the same themes that we were doing on modern historical frontiers. And all of you here agree with me. I think that the most interesting processes, the most significant events in the life of empires, many of the most interesting people are on the borders, or what other people might call marginal places. But this is where the action happens. This is where maybe the more general processes that shape the evolution of empires actually become most clear in frontier regions and often have the most decisive impact. But as is expressed in this book, and is also true for historians, the predominant focus of most historians, and I think archaeologists, is on the centers, on the imperial centers, and on the elites in those centers. And partly that's a product of course, the sources we have. The majority of historical sources are written by these elites in imperial cores. But it's also a difference of perspective. I think you can find the sources on the frontiers. You can find the sites, as you have found, on the frontiers. You can find out things there. Brad and I were quite simpatico in intellectual outlook back in 2001. I was really happy that somebody from a different discipline was going along some of the same lines that I was. I enjoyed meeting the people there. I also got a great week of skiing in at Utah after the conference, so I have very fond memories of that conference. The next conference on Imperial Formations was held in SAR, and the book was published in 2007, organized by Ann Stoler, an anthropologist of the Dutch Empire, and her student Carol McGranahan, who works on Tibet. This was an effort to carry forward the comparative study of empires of early modern and modern times, and built on the earlier work of Ann Stoler and Fred Cooper on empires, European empires. And that again was a wonderful conference in the New Mexico desert, a perfect place for intellectual stimulation. And as is mentioned in this book, it is perhaps a flaw that we didn't include any archaeologists in our discussions at that point. But I thought it's a big enough challenge just to have several modern empires together, and especially Asian empires alongside European ones. That was the main goal of that particular volume, that these imperial formations include not just the standard European ones, but also the empires of Asia, China, Japan, and others. And I'm happy to see that this book really carries on that project that at least began 20 years ago. It was pioneered by Brad. So I think this approach is not only alive and well, but thriving. To respond to this particular question, that in fact we worked, I remember, on this term imperial formations as a title. We might have spent an entire day discussing what the right title would be. And formation is a critical word here. That is, it's a dynamic process, active and contingent, making and unmaking. An empire is not a thing, but the standard descriptions of most empires, at least in most social science, I believe, even now, but back then, it's a thing, it's a category, it's a large space in which things happen. In sociology, this new approach would be called, I think, processual sociology. That's Andrew Abbott's idea. Sociology should be about events, not categories, networks, not classifications, moving things, processes, constructions, and destructions. Well, for historians, in some way, this is sort of like speaking prose. I mean, this seems like common sense. Historians, we pride ourselves on writing narratives that talk about change over time. So aren't we already doing this? Well, not so much, because our narratives are really confined to nation states and mostly the elite actors of nation states. The traditional history covers a limited period of time. It looks at active individuals, usually members of ruling political and intellectual elites, predominantly male in dominant ethnicities. It just leaves out a lot of people and a lot of human social life. Social history does try to tell history from the bottom up, and social historians have made great progress over the last 20, 30 years in finding the stories of women, of minorities, of oppressed people in many, many places. But most of social history burrows into the micro level of the nation state and doesn't go beyond it. And so the newest trend in history, as it were, at least the buzzwords from the last 10 years, goes by many names, but it can be transnational history, global history, world history, border crossing history, new imperial history, and so forth. So I think that's what this project is heading towards, and that's where it converges with what historians are doing now. What I find attractive about empires and this approach is, by their very nature, empires are diverse, they're evolving, they're dispersed, they're often inclusive, they are also violent. We shouldn't romanticize them, but they're a counterpart to some of our inherited assumptions about nation states, which are, at least in a stereotyped version, seen as homogeneous, populist, confined by borders, defined by fixed ideologies, competing with other nation states that are all built on the same model. So if we move in this direction, the way imperial formation started and archaeologies of empire does, we challenge not only the inherited sociological categorizations that are static and bounded, we also challenge the way historians write their narratives. because archaeology, as the book makes very clear, this book is intended to challenge not just archaeologists, but historians too, to show that archaeologists have material and perspectives and theories that modern historians should pay attention to. As I see it, I mean, I suppose have been member of the choir of this particular group for a while, at least virtually. And my own personal work has moved on from looking at the expansion of the Qing Empire in the 17th and 18th century as a dynamic contingent process to an even more foolish and ambitious idea to cover the entire world around the year 1900. And that I might explain later, but I will turn it over to other people to focus on this book.
Anna, Bleda, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. So I guess we do feel that our book is kind of continuing the same path as the Imperial Formations, in the sense that Imperial Formations, one of the main arguments was that we shouldn't isolate Western empires, Western colonial empires, from those in other parts of the world. But it did, in a way, focus on sort of the emergence of the modern world and the role of empires in that world. And we felt that a lot of the things that were discussed for modern empires were also relevant to ancient empires, the ones that we are interested in as archaeologists. And that a lot of the things that were being argued for modern colonial empires were equally relevant, and they hadn't been really brought to the fore so much. Archaeology somehow was out of this new imperial histories, if you want to call it that, discussion altogether. So studies of ancient empires were often very static, and they sort of started with very general models, things like what Ludwig has been arguing back in the 70s, I think, hegemonic and territorial. So classifications, types of empires, and then coming up with sort of ideal models of what these things would look like, and then trying to match that with archaeological data sets. Whereas in fact, if you look closely at these archaeological data, you see that things are much more messy. There's a large degree of variability, and it's only when you start to look at actual processes and practices on the ground and have a real understanding of how empires work that you can start to make sense of these things. And for doing that, we found a lot of inspiration from these new imperial histories and this idea that empires are always in the making, always unstable, always dynamic, always borrowing practices and elements from older imperial formations. So we found a lot of common ground with the historical studies. And so that was partly the start of our project, to sort of bring this archaeological data into that conversation. And so I'm happy it sort of resonates, at least with Peter, and I hope more broadly, and that sort of archaeological data is relevant for understanding imperialism from its very early origins up to the present, I would say.
I wanted to add that I was a graduate student during those incipient years that Peter just described, and was also a graduate student when Imperial Formations came out. And so these were foundational texts for me when I was thinking through empire. And I think anyone reading Archaeologies of Empire and seeing the term Imperial Formations littered throughout the book would see that it's certainly made its impact in the literature, and that one day of debate that Peter and his colleagues had was well worth it, and that it helped to direct us into how we were thinking about empire and the transitions it goes through. And we also quite agreed, as Bleda just said, that we need to look beyond European formations of empire in order to understand how empires work. And one of the things that we thought was complementary about our approach is that the ancient empires that we discussed, with the exception of the one I discussed, which is the ancient Roman Empire, were all non-European empires. You can see from this map, which is of the empires that we discussed in the book, that they're all outside of that area that is considered the core of imperial development in terms of the way people who do the new imperial histories or do modern empires tend to look. And so we really kind of wanted to add that perspective to complement what inroads Imperial Formations had already made. The other thing that came up for us that was a slightly different question that they also touched on in Imperial Formations is that the idea of ordinary people and their contribution to empire is an essential one. And Catherine Lutz has this wonderful quote that empire is in the details. And it is these details that I think were of particular interest to us. And as archaeologists, we have particular facility to recover. Catherine Lutz advocated for an ethnography of empire. And although archaeologists, as Ken Flannery says, are the only ethnographers who kill their informants, we do have these remarkable informants in the form of the material record. And we can get into these incredibly invasive questions that informants might not want to answer, they might not know how to answer, they might not even think to answer in a certain way. So dietary practices, for example, might change with the incoming of an empire, and we can have access to what did change, what didn't change by looking at the remains of people's food consumption in houses and things like that. So we do have access to these details that help to give a richness to the study of empire and also help us to understand how ordinary people, ordinary agents contribute to the imperial project, how they push against it, how they can passively kind of foot drag and disable certain apertures of the empire from continuing. So in many ways, our work complemented Imperial Formations by adding both the time depth and also the stories, these details of empire that Imperial Formations observed in the introduction that was something that they wanted to include more of, but that they had focused largely on kind of the apertures of empire rather than those ordinary people. So they are complementary works, and we can't really blame Imperial Formations for not including archaeologists because that was a hefty project that they took on. And we also didn't include modern historians in ours, and that was something that we had wished to do as potentially a secondary project, is something we really would like to try to bridge this gap between ancient and modern empires. And we see quite a bit of connections between these books, and that enabled us to draw a roadmap for how we think these connections could be forged in future projects.
Yes, we could aim for a Hegelian synthesis and have a third project that would now bring the teams together. I think that would be great, amazingly productive. I'm also very happy that in Archaeologies of Empire, you have the chapter by Alice Yao on the Han Dynasty in China, which on your map of the world, it might be worth noting where exactly her site is. It's on the far distant border of China and Inner Asia, which is not a place that most archaeologists of China ever go, although there is substantial documentation there. So again, being on the frontiers, on the borderland, it's reshaping Chinese archaeology too in a very strong way. And I think deserves to be continued. The idea of ordinary people is, of course, something a social historian would always endorse, but even social history is limited in certain ways. We actually don't do much about the material lives, and not enough, the material lives of ordinary people in the modern era. And the material turn is another phenomenon of recent historical study that is trying to do things with historical demography and landscape and place. And especially now this year, there's been a huge proliferation of studies of disease and disease regimes in history. But we are getting closer to the material issues, I think, the archaeologists have been doing all the time. There's some convergence there.
Michael, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I was struck by Peter's comment about the edge of empires, and then that came up in Anna's comment too. I mean, years ago, SAR did another advanced seminar called War in the Tribal Zone, in which I was a participant, but the late Neil Whitehead and Brian Ferguson were the editors. And one of the things that we talked about was why or how the edges of empires often turn out to be very violent places, in part because there's, and here I'm thinking of my own work in South America, there's such a disconnect between, say, production regimes and social formations in the eastern side of the Andes in comparison to the Andean civilizations, which on your map you could see there was Wari and Tiwanaku and Inca, and to some extent they built on each other. So do you have any comments on that? I mean, certainly there's some evidence in some situations that empires just come up against forces that they can't resolve or they can't integrate into their system because they're so different. It could be a different environmental regime. It could be different types of people. Was that something that you addressed in this most recent book?
We did to some extent. I work on the Borderlands of Empire, as do a lot of the contributors to the book. So it did come up quite a bit in specific among the specific chapters in the book. And I agree that the edges of empire are a fascinating area to work on. And my own contribution compared two different edges of empire and the massive disparity in how the Roman Empire managed those areas, and as well as how the individual agents in those areas contributed to the imperial project or worked against it. And you're quite right that edges offer a bit of a sticky issue for empires, because sometimes there's someone beyond it that is a significant force that they are unable to conquer, and they don't know quite what to do about that. In Roman period Egypt, we had quite a few nomadic groups that the Romans found really frustrating because it's hard to conquer a people that don't have cities, and Herodotus even describes this issue. And so they kept coming up as a significant concern, and a lot of the documentary sources seem to oversubscribe issues to these nomadic peoples. We'll find archaeologically that settlements are continuing and thriving, but the documentary sources describe that settlement as destroyed by these nomads. And additionally, beyond the borders of the Roman Empire in Egypt, we had the Meroitic Kingdom in Nubia, which the Romans tried to head down to and to conquer, and it didn't work out. So they formed a treaty, and they moved along just fine. But the person who did the treaty himself was disposed of because he neglected to mention that there was a broader imperial Roman center behind himself, and that he wasn't the sole ruler of the entity in Egypt. But there was a lot of awkwardness that was created by the idea that Rome could not advance further south, and that they could not take over these peoples. So these borders are these continual negotiation places of where the edge of the empire is. They don't tend to demarcate them with walls or anything like that. So it's usually done with people, products, and material goods, activities, performances, all of those things. And there are different edges depending on which of those categories you look at.
Mm. Would it be accurate to say that sedentism is a close to universal requirement for integration into an empire, or is that going too far? I'm sure that you can think of exceptions, but I can't think of one offhand.
Well, I can cite the Comanche Empire by Pekka, Finnish name person, sorry, forgot his exact name. The Comanche Empire was a joint pastoral and settled empire, certainly. And I would argue all empires integrate, or at least include, elements from both pastoralism and sedentarism. Usually your pastoral peoples are your major warriors, of course, and you need horses, either by trade or by having them as part of your own army. But the way sedentary empires portray this is quite differently in the official texts. In the text, it's those barbarians out there are always attacking us and raiding us, and we are just defensive. We just, China did actually build quite a few walls. Even the Romans built one, I believe, up there in Scotland. Walls are portrayed in official texts as defensive formations against raids by inherently violent people from the outside. Have we heard this? No, that was in the ancient past, of course. We wouldn't do that these days.
Although I would like to say that the recent SAR volume on walling in and walling out has also questioned the significance and the lasting impact of many of those walls. That many walls last, I think they said only about 70 years, and that many of these empires consider the walls that they built to be spectacular failures because they do not actually serve to withstand the breaches on them. So that one was quite a useful volume for me to look at to consider, what those walls actually signify in those ancient contexts. And a lot of those walled areas are actually extremely vibrant, connecting points between the empire and the people beyond. And actually, there's some fieldwork in New Mexico that shows that some of the fortresses that the Spanish set up to protect Santa Fe actually show a lot of interconnections between the Spanish colonists and indigenous peoples that they were trying to protect from going into Santa Fe, and that they were dependent upon them for survival. So a lot of these ideas of hardened fortresses and of walls and those sorts of things in the documentary sources, they sound really substantial, they sound really critical. But when you look on the ground and you see what people are actually doing and what they're not, maybe sending back to Spain reports that they've married a local lady and that they're eating food prepared by them, they kind of fall apart.
I think it's one of the ideas that Alice Yao has in our volume is that if you look at China, for example, the purpose of that wall might have been to keep people in rather than to keep people out. So it's very different from how we think of modern walls and international boundaries. And I think a lot of this imperialism and frontier behavior is about actually people. And so the Assyrian Empire, for example, and this is the topic that Bradley Parker would have loved to talk about. One of the main things that these Assyrians were doing was raiding the periphery, really just looting, burning down settlements. But the main purpose was to get people. And all of these people were being deported, resettled into the core of the empire. They had a constant hunger for manpower. And so there was an enormous area around the empire that was largely depopulated, and that served as a restocking of populations. And so keeping people in and keeping people under control and making them work for you, that was a pretty brutal aspect of these empires. And I'm not saying they're all the same, of course, but you can see these types of behaviors in many ancient empires, where they're basically harvesting people in the peripheries and creating these empty buffer zones at the same time.
That's right. I think it was Owen Lattimore who really inspired me the most, actually, who was maybe the first to propose that the purpose of the Great Walls in China was more to keep Han settlers in than to keep nomads out. And it's a strange thing, though, that the actual archaeology of the Great Walls, there's not just one wall, in China. The one everybody sees as tourists is a very late one from the 16th century, but there are hundreds and hundreds of walls. Archaeology of walls in China is a very undeveloped field. Chinese archaeologists are only interested in cities, not in frontier settlements and walls very much, so we don't know enough about that. Harvesting people is a key element of many empires, as for example in Southeast Asia, where the different states of Southeast Asia, the Burmese and the Siamese and others, were mostly making war over manpower. The territory did not matter much. Your state depended on collecting peoples into your center, and there were very blurred boundaries of where one empire ended and the next one began.
Can I follow up, and then I'll do a handoff to Sarah, but I was intrigued by Peter's comment about the Comanche Empire, and this sort of leads into a question that came in from Wayne Lee. Is that, by the way, the questions are really stacking up quickly, but he asks, I wonder how you distinguish between state and empire in your respective discussions. Is there a difference in institutions? It seems that very often states are formed as much from conquest processes as are empires, which raises the question. I mean, one could debate whether the Comanche were an empire. They certainly weren't a state. So what is the Venn diagram of state and empire in terms of your assessment of it?
Should I start on this? I don't know. I mean, I would confess to Anna that Lutwak's book did influence, it probably still has a lingering bad influence on me from a long time back. But of course, the discussion of the Augustan threshold, I don't know if he brought that up, but others do, where somehow a collection, a federation, or some other kind of grouping crosses a certain boundary from conquest into consolidation, and then it becomes a state. Or some people might call that two different phases of an empire, a conquest phase and a consolidation phase. But this book points out as well that that doesn't have to be a necessary or linear process, and maybe we've misconceived it all along, that you don't just go linearly from conquest to consolidation and then stop and have a long empire. There are always, if you like, backsliding or flows or threats. But another way to see it is, as Brad Parker did in this book, territory versus hegemony, which is really, I think, in a sociological term, categories versus networks. So territory is a category with defined boundaries when you know where people are. Networks are places where you have personal relationships that create what ties things together. And this whole idea of state versus empire, I think, could be reconceived in these terms, as Brad put it, territory versus hegemony, or networks versus states. And that would bring things into a more up-to-date way of thinking about things, I think. What would you say about the Roman Empire, Anna, from this point of view?
Yeah, I think, for me, the definition of empire is usually involves, well, first imperialism, but you can have imperialism without empire, where you're conquering people and using hegemonic processes to do that. But when it really becomes an empire for me is when you've actually consolidated it, as you said. There's like some longevity to it to hold that into place, and that also, to me, must include a bit more difference than just people in the immediate surroundings. So to me, it needs to have both that kind of aggressive imperialism side, as well as holding on to things, as well as including some difference in ethnicity, linguistics, territory, goods, that sort of thing, and that's what starts to make an empire. And I quite agree with you that this is not a linear process, that it has lots of fits and starts. And one of the things that we were quite interested in this book was, and would love to chase up in more detail, is the failure of some states to assemble all of the necessary components to have a stable empire. So one of the articles in this book discussed the different predecessor states to the Inca, Tiwanaku and Wari, and how those states contributed to the imperial repertoires that enabled the Inca to develop their empire incredibly swiftly. So although they themselves were in some senses imperialistic or had certain repertoires that we would associate with empires, they weren't able to complete all of them and sustain an empire. And the language I use sometimes sounds like this is an achievement to have an empire, and that you're kind of addressing successive steps. Not all of these entities were necessarily thinking of or desiring to become an empire, but by creating these different repertoires, others were able to benefit from them who did want to have that form of conquest and that form of rule over other people. And so we do have these interesting histories that develop with these repertoires becoming attached and detached from different polities over time, and some of which qualify as empires, others of which don't. And fortunately, we now have that language of imperial formations to describe all of those processes of becoming, existing, and and unbecoming over time.
Mhm. Yeah, for in terms of long lasting, you see the Chinese view is rather strange from this perspective, because there are 25 official Chinese dynasties, but most of them lasted a very, very short time, including the so-called first Chinese empire, the Qin Empire, lasted about 20 years. But that's still counted as an empire because it's seen as having prepared the way for the long-lasting Han Empire, the two Han empires that lasted 400 years. So I suppose you could see that as building, the Han builds on the Qin repertoire in that sense. But the Qin did not intend to collapse in 20 years. The first emperor thought he was creating something that was going to last forever, So this very sort of simple, familiar thing, everybody has to teach it in a lecture, that you've got Qin and Han, and then you have Sui and Tang, the short Sui, the long Tang, and so forth. Doesn't correspond to what the original founders intended to do. Doesn't even imply that the Han was an inevitable result of the Qin. It's just a convenient ex post facto rationalization, I think. And archaeology immerses you in the materials of the time, rather than the historical documents which are written much later. I think that's an issue that we might talk about. History is always written, as it were, backwards, by people who are justifying creating memories in their own time with their own agenda. That's why we love primary sources, except that those too have their biases. They're better than the later. Still, what do you think about that? Or Sarah has.
That leads into one of our questions from Lynn Withy, who asks if you can talk about what kinds of evidence archaeology brings to imperial history. And I would add to that, how do you identify what's partial or absent, and how does that add to our understanding of what's recorded or physically present?
Yeah. So traditionally, archaeologists would go for the capitals and the elites and see what we can find of those capitals and elites spread throughout the empire, and sort of see that as an index for these empires and imperialism. But increasingly, we're turning to provincial and peripheral data sets to look at what's actually happening on the ground in these particular imperial moments. And we can see all kinds of, for example, new agricultural foundations, where suddenly areas of the countryside that were not populated before are being farmed. You can see all kinds of new repertoires of material culture moving in. But at the same time, you can see other elements that are local or vernacular that are mixing in with these newcomers. You can see, for example, if your data set's good enough, you can see people being moved across the empire, and you can see bits of material culture that are associated with a region far away suddenly springing up in other parts of the empire. So if you have a knowledge of how empires work, there's lots of little elements or data that fit into that general picture. You can have houses, for example, if I talk about the Assyrians, which is one of the things that I've been investigating, you can have houses that are completely Assyrian in their layout, but suddenly there's a burial in that house that is it's completely un-Assyrian. And so you can see that people may be living in sort of imperial ways, but then burying themselves in completely other customs. And so there's a lot of data out there in the archaeological data that can tell you about the intricacies and the negotiations that are going on in that process.
And Sarah asked about the gaps and where we're missing information. And I think it was Carlo Ginzburg who said that we should get excited about gaps or about not having data. And I'm not quite there yet, but sometimes it is interesting. And in my work in the Dakhla Oasis, that some of the gaps have been rather fascinating, because we have a huge population boom that appears in the Roman period. And it seems that a bunch of people were moving there, perhaps incentivized by the Roman Empire to develop that area, or they realized that this was a zone that the Romans were putting a lot of economic investment into, and that this was a good place to move to further their own lives. So it might have been driven by the agents themselves. And one of the things that suggests that people were, with either scenario, not unhappy with it is that I don't have evidence suggesting where these people came from. They don't seem to have mementos of their past places of occupation. They don't seem to have practices that suggest other regions within Egypt. We just have archaeological signatures that relate to specifically the Dakhla Oasis, and also to Hellenistic Greek practices, sometimes Roman practices. So we don't have things that tie to other regions. So they seem to have created this interesting entanglement of different cultures, particularly to that region, but not trying to like draw from something from another region in Egypt or from further afield. So they may have been content there. So that gap may be interesting in the data for telling us if the people were okay with being in this new location.
I mean, the great gap for both historians and archaeologists is the subjective experience of people of the past. And on the issue of frontier settlement, we have Chinese elite sources. Elites were exiled to frontiers because of crimes and political factionalism. They are always lamenting that the frontier is so barren and they wish they were back home. And it's a great tradition of Chinese elite poetry. But the frontier settlers themselves were given incentives to go out there, horses and grain and tools, and they cleared these agricultural settlements. And maybe they didn't want to go back home. One of the most fascinating aspects of Alice Yao's part was to show these graves in the far frontier of the Han Dynasty. If you were a Chinese settler, like the Chinese Americans who came to the New World, you wanted to send your coffin back home, if at all possible. And you had prepared it in advance to be sent back home. And that wasn't any different in the Han Dynasty. So either those people were too poor to send their coffins back home, or they actually wanted to stay there. I think she calls it a homescape. They had created a home on the frontier. The idea in China that you would actually want to live on this barren, marginal land is quite hard to grasp for many Chinese in the core. I did want to ask one question for you archaeologists about data. Have you become interested in skeletal DNA analysis? And I've been reading a bit about that, but what do you think can be done with that?
This is a frontier of archaeology in a way, or has been for a while, but from the isotopes that you can extract from skeletons, you can say a lot about where people might have migrated from. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect is you can say a lot about what they were eating. And so you can try to reconstruct different dietary practices and see whether there's a difference between imperial foodways and local foodways, and whether there's a merging at some point, or and that these are very intricate things, of course, that you would never be able to usually extract only from the kind of cooking pots that they were using. Sometimes that can tell us a lot, but it won't get you the whole story. So yeah, we are getting a lot of that kind of data now, and that's really changing our understanding of those imperial contacts.
I've got a question from Robin Hoffman. It says, would Anna explain the meaning of aperture in the context she's using it?
So yeah, Imperial Aperture, I'm using it as a synonym for imperial repertoires. So thinking about different apparatuses that empires use in order to further their own projects. So things like resettlement of peoples, in terms of taxation systems, in terms of various ways of incentivizing people to dwell in certain areas. So all of those things would fall under the rubric of imperial repertoires, but I'm also using apparatus and all of those things as synonymous with it.
Joyce Frey writes, as an international psychologist with an emphasis on systems and organizations, I'm curious if you have seen any consistency or disparity in what I refer to as the triad of understanding, including the ontology, epistemology, and axiology of empires.
I'm not sure what axiology means, I have to say. I would associate it, at least that with the term axial age, which was a concept of the German, who was it, Jaspers, yes, in the early modern age, to saying that certain empires became cores of civilizational processes in about the first millennium BCE. If that's what he means, well, maybe we are trying to unpack this a bit. That the ontology, the empire claims to be heaven sent. It is directly derived from divine cosmic forces. Most of them say that. Epistemology, the empire, the emperors, the ruling elites have superior knowledge because it's universal. It might be a religious tradition. Axiology, that I would interpret as meaning centrality. They kind of see themselves as a civilizational, political, and social core, and even a model for others. And so the traditional, I think, world histories of world civilizations have been based on that triad, as if it was an immutable package, as it were, that kind of held together. One thing I didn't do, I meant to do, was I have a pile of world history textbooks here that I was going to look through and see if this perspective of Archaeologies of Empire is reflected in the world history textbooks of the last 10, 15 years. And having perpetrated one myself, I have to say I'm sorry that my own limitations and others, we probably won't find much of it. We will still find more of the axial age civilizational model. And how do we tell a major story? That's, I think, an issue. How do we tell the big story of human civilization if we don't use those civilizational models? How do we incorporate all this new data, all this diversity and local conditions into a larger narrative? Perhaps you want to address that.
I think that gets into, I guess, one of the other common narratives among empires is this, what Edward Said describes as a discourse of exceptionalism, which I think encourages all of us to view our empire as kind of singular and separate from other empires. And one of the things that I think has caused scholars of the ancient world and the modern world to separate ourselves, that we find that modernity is this singular thing, that we've been seduced by this idea of exceptionalism, but rather there's a lot in common between these different empires. And that now that we have all this wonderful new data from the imperial histories scholars who are working with ethnographies and new sources from the archives, and archaeologists working with new material data drawn from houses and tombs of ordinary people, we can build that up to create a new way of thinking about empires, a much more complicated way that joins together both the ancient world and the modern world to try to get out of this discourse of exceptionalism that empires want us to fall into, and that we have in large ways fallen into over the years.
There's a comment here from Vince Piggott. He says this whole discussion of borderland interactions between empires and the peripheries brings to mind the concept of the shatter zone discussed by James C. Scott in his Art of Not Being Governed. I haven't read it, so I'm at a disadvantage here, but are there observations in Scott's work that you found useful in these projects?
Well, I think we are all big fans of Scott's work because it shows the fundamental importance of what ordinary people do on a daily basis for understanding big imperial formations and understanding why they work or why they do not work. And we already discussed previously that there were incentives. Empires weren't just brutal forces that took over societies, and they did a lot of deportation and killing, of course, and there were lots of nasty elements to empires, but there were also a lot of people who benefited from empires, who got a new chance in life, who were given a piece of land to farm and to prosper, and we shouldn't sort of blot that out. And I think that the work of Scott really shows us that if you don't look at it that way from the lens of ordinary people and why they would have chipped in and participated in these imperial projects, then you're not going to understand why some of these empires lasted hundreds of years even. I mean, some of the empires we study are 700 years or even longer in duration, and they have successor empires that continue after they end. And that's really a remarkable thing. And I think so we need to look at what these empires did for normal people, and that's an important part of the explanation of their longevity and their success.
Well, I'm not only a fan of Jim Scott, I'm one of his colleagues at Yale, and we have co-taught courses together, and I find him always incredibly inspiring, fascinating, exciting, and sometimes exasperating, because he pushes his concepts maybe a little farther than I would go, and nevertheless always forces you to think about things. So Art of Not Being Governed is an anarchist analysis, which is not favorable to empires. For him, it's the people who flee these settled sedentary zones who are his heroes, as it were, who go into highlands and set up their own mobile cropping systems for what he calls escape agriculture, tubers that you can harvest from underground so that the state can't get at them the way they can with grain, you know. And swidden cultivation, mobile cultivation, as opposed to sedentary states. So these are Scott's counterexamples to the benefits of empire. In his later book, Against the Grain, he goes even more radical. As you know, it's grain agriculture that has been the bane of the human race, has tied people to the ground as slaves to elites. Well, again, he goes too far, I suppose. But by going too far, he makes us rethink, what does grain agriculture really do to people, and how does it shape their life? It is well known, I believe, that pastoral people are healthier in general, as was observed by many observers, until settled people come in contact with them and spread diseases to them. But pastoralists who live off animals and grassland and move around generally don't have the diseases that you have in settled environments. I think that's why Scott is always provocative, somebody you want to use and argue against sometimes, but also make you think of new ways of conceiving these questions.
Thanks.
We're approaching the hour, so I think we should finish with one last question from one of our current resident fellows, Scott Ortman, who asks, what do you all think about how placing ancient and modern empires in a single analytical frame might help us shape a better tomorrow?
Well, I think that would be extremely helpful because we see our imperial repertoires have been produced and reproduced over a very long period of time. And although I think a lot of people debate whether certain contemporary states are empires or not, I think once you start to look at the different repertoires of rule that are commonly being used today, I think that they can help us to see that empires are alive and well in the world today, and can help us to think through, well, what is beneficial about empires, as we've sometimes been talking, and what is not. And I think once we get out of this, the sort of vocabulary that we use to separate out empires, colonialism, and post-colonialism, and start to just think about these contributing repertoires of empire, I think that would be a helpful way to think about the contemporary world and the future. And one of the things I really enjoyed about Imperial Formations is they did query that post-colonial world, and they described, in essence, the imperial repertoires that are still being used in these areas that are supposedly post-colonial and no longer under colonial control, but they are still being controlled by using these specific repertoires in the present day. So peeling back some of that discourse, I think, would be very helpful for thinking about the present and the future.
I just say, I think we know there's a very large public demand for large-scale narratives and analyses that go from ancient times to the present day. If you look at the big bestseller '*Sapiens" by Yuval Harari, for example, it shows that this has attracted people. And I'm not critical of the book. I think he's quite a remarkable one-man band who has shown that there really is a need for people to understand our human species from the origins to the present. So it does require, though, teamwork. A team project is another way to do this, with archaeologists and modern historians working together. And it's important both for the continuities and the discontinuities. So to show the repertoires, to show that where things were invented in ancient times are still being used today, is very important to undercut national myths. The US is still an empire. Yeah, not an informal empire, a real empire. We have Puerto Rico, we have Guam, we have these anomalous, not to mention Native American reservations. These are not part of the Orthodox American administrative structure. These are imperial formations. But they're also, empires are also important for discontinuities. They are the world we have lost in certain ways, a world of flexibility, of where people weren't locked into borders and ethnic categories the way they are. A violent world, but not our kind of violent world. So I think we could learn both from empires' continuities, repertoires, and as even resources that we might well want to go back to and revive for the present day.
Leda, did you want to add anything?
Well, yeah, from a European perspective, I see a world that's increasingly dominated by a few global powers. And of course, there's the United States, there is China, and there is Europe. And it's important to be aware of what kinds of states preceded us, what kind of empires, what kind of formations, and how they might play a role in what's happening today. And to be aware of these types of structural imbalances and the tendency of power to center in particular societies, and to deal with that as much as we can. If we're talking about making a better world, there are real risks of ending up with just a few big imperial formations. So yes, I'm worried, and I think that this type of knowledge might benefit us if we act on time.
Michael, any last words?
No, I just first I want to apologize to the people who provided other comments and questions that we didn't get to. A couple of people were checking in from various parts of the world and saying thank you for an invigorating discussion. And I'd like to thank our guests for doing a great job. This is the first in what I hope will be a long series of book talks that Sarah Solis has put together, and I look forward to more. But thank you all. Thanks to everybody who joined us for this, and I look forward to reading the book.
I just want to give a big thank you to everyone who joined us, to all of the panelists, to Michael, to the staff at SAR who helped me make this happen. And to say, don't forget to check out, as Anna mentioned, last spring's new release, Walling In and Walling Out, Why Are We Building New Barriers to Divide Us, edited by Laura McAtackney and Randall McGuire. And next spring, look for Religious Transformation in Maya Guatemala, Cultural Collapse and Christian Pentecostal Revitalization, written and edited by John P. Hawkins. Thank you everyone so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.